I'm Emma Donoghue, and I'm the author of Kissing the Witch, which began as a book of linked short stories and then became a play, and now is having its Irish premiere and I think its digital premiere.
It is,
Very exciting.
yeah. Well, it's great to have you on the Access Chats, Emma. And before we get to the splendor of your digital world premiere of your Kissing the Witch, I want to kind of um, first of all say, well, you're in Canada at the moment, so you're kind of, I'm speaking to you. I think it's my first Canadian Access Chat. So there you go. That's a digital premiere in itself. Come here. When you were, do you think, looking back on yourself as a kind of small girl, do you think that you were destined to become a writer? Was it kind of in your blood and your family was, were you always at it?
Well, put it this way, I have no other skills. I tried being a chambermaid and I was sacked for poor hygiene, so this is it. This is it, Mark. No, it was a very bookish household, you could say. Like the walls were always, lined with books. And my dad's a professor of English. He's still writing now. My mum was an English teacher with a passion for history. But on the other hand, there are 8 of us, and I'm the only one who became a writer. So, your environment does not completely determine what you do. We all went off in very much different directions.
Yeah.
But I have to say that since I started writing poetry at about the age of 7, this has been the thing that rings my bell.
Wow. And was it that, like, when you started writing at the age of 7, was it something private for yourself, or did you read that to the
No,
family?
I'm afraid not the whole family, but I inflicted them all on my parents. Yeah, I'd shoot straight into their room and sometimes wake them up, and say, I have a new poem. And, full credit to them. They never said, get lost or maybe later. My mother would listen to these poems, which were indescribable things about fairies or about the crucifixion. And then she'd say, oh, I'd love a copy. So I'd write her out a copy. So yeah, very supportive.
It's all your parents' fault, actually.
Exactly. I should have been squashed, stood on sometime in the early 70s. Yeah.
That's
See what it leads to when you encourage your children.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You go from kind of fairies to the crucifixion, themes that have remained somebody in your work. Come here to me, tell me then, like, what, and was it something that, an awful lot of kids at kind of that age, write, and, they kind of develop work, and all my kids are kind of, but they grow out of it and they kind of find different things. But did you kind of find yourself then, I don't mean serious in a serious way, but when did you find yourself kind of getting lost in it, do you think? Like, was there a period you kind of went?
Well, writing really got me through my teens, I mean, it was such a source of, consolation, especially, if you have this doomed crush on a girl in your school and you can't tell anyone in the world because they'll send you to the priest or the psychiatrist, being able to pour it out in intense love poems with no pronouns was crucial, and I used to analyze my own work even in my teens. I'd write the poem and then on the other side I'd do a kind of a professorial analysis of, I would say things like, Donoghue relies too much on words like bittersweet, so I was trying to develop this critical eye, which of course you should never use during the first draft. You have to let your inner writer run wild. But then in the second draft, it's quite helpful to come along and go, oh, that metaphor doesn't quite work. So yeah, I was more and more into it in my teens. And then I think at 19, when I went to UCD, in second year, I started a novel, and I was doing plays in UCD from, I think, my first term there. And gradually moving from adapting Shakespeare and Webster and so on into writing my own plays. So yeah, each time I added a new genre, I was like, oh yes, this is even more me. So finally I would say novels and plays turned out to be the thing that really satisfied me.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned there, like, back kind of as a teenager in school, and kind of your poetry or your kind of writing getting you through school, and the kind of, the themes, the personal themes you were exploring for yourself, because it's fascinating. We're of similar vintage, and you kind of, you now in the Ireland and in the world, I suppose, that we're kind of in, has moved on so much from say the mid 70s, early 80s, or even late 80s, early 90s. But was that a huge pressure for you as a young girl, kind of growing up, in that time, and a poetry being that kind of special place? You say, it's either that or the priest or the psychiatrist.
It felt like a real break from my own culture, or defense against my own culture. I mean, I remember a moment in the mid 80s when there was the moving statues phenomenon, and yeah. I was like, get me out of here. What is this medieval, dystopia that I'm trapped in. I mean, yeah, I was in Dublin, so it wasn't quite so bad, but I still had a feeling of, these are not my people, and so being able to identify with oddballs like David Bowie, Freddie Mercury, Emily Dickinson, a sense of literary history, and a feeling, I quickly noticed that people had been falling in love with people of the same sex in literature, really on and off throughout literary history. So basically the arts gave me such a feeling of like a secret outlet. I remember seeing a great play, Frank Observe the Sons of Ulster Marching Towards the Sun. Frank McGuinness. I remember seeing that play, which includes a love between two men who are fighting at the Somme, and thinking like, oh, somebody out there understands me, And the same with the production of Salome, So these literary and theatrical touchstones and poetry and even pop music, they were all a little glimpse of a freer world. So they were absolutely crucial for getting.
I mean, it's fascinating because you mentioned the non-pronouns in poetry, but I mean that as a mechanism in poetry goes kind of right back, Shakespeare, the romantic poets, and in that way sort of, I remember that space well of the unattainable, we were all there, but I suppose when you're talking about it being of the same sex, or kind of doubling down in that era on what not so much the unattainability, but the unacceptability of your feelings.
Yeah, which makes you feel like Romeo and Juliet. You feel so star-crossed and doomed. And the weird thing was, you see, I was kind of high status in every other way, right? I was in a very, comfortable and supportive family, getting good marks, leading the debate team at school, running the school magazine, and yet I thought if they knew I was gay, it would all be over. So it was a very odd feeling. It's like kind of imposter syndrome, like I seem like a good girl, but if only they knew, So yeah, no wonder I got very attached to poetry. Yeah.
I'm gonna say, and so then in college, then I mean, you studied English and French, was it?
English and French, yeah. A bit of economics in the first year, and then quickly shed that. So yeah, English and French, and they were both excellent things to study. Actually, even though French wasn't as much my key love, the French department was much more open-minded about things like they had courses on theatre and film and autobiography. They were, much more genre curious than the English department were. So no, they were both really splendid experiences. I only had 3 years in UCD, but it was very formative. I experienced it as so free compared with my school days.
Yeah, no, I think I similarly, it's kind of.
And Dramsoc, it was worth going to UCD just to be in Dramsoc.
Who was around you in Dramsoc then?
People like Dervla Crotty. She was she was in the first play I did in Dramsoc, and I suddenly realized, oh whoa, I'm not actually a good actor. I was good in school terms, but not in university terms. So I thought I better start writing plays instead. So encountering talents like her made me actually step to one side and say, I think I'll write these things instead.
Yeah. It's gas. I did economics in first year as well, and kind of similarly, I kind of went, no. It's kind of Come here to me. Then in college, say in relation to your writing, and because you've written like a lot of, so I suppose theory books as well, or not theory, but like exploratory books, or theory books as well. So like when you were kind of studying and writing, what were you kind of? I mean, we'll talk about your PhD in a minute, but what were you kind of becoming very interested in the departments?
I suppose, one thing I really remember is those courses on theatre and film and French, because I got very interested in those different genres and what happens to stories as they move between genres. And, I've ended up not only being involved in, say, films or theatre versions of my own work, but really interested in how the story changes as it puts on those different masks. I suppose I was very interested in feminism. Yeah, and I'd been a kind of a instinctive feminist in my teens, and at university I added to that a lot.
Yeah.
And I don't know, cultural history broadly, I suppose. Maybe I should have studied history because I clearly love history, but I just had at the time had an impression of history as entirely being about minor Irish revolutions that didn't work, so I was just turned off history as it seemed. But I realized social history rings my bell in a big way. So but above all, I just loved close study of literature. I love those tutorials where you'd be sweating over exactly what that line meant.
Yeah. And I we were chatting to you earlier on. We both studied English and UCD, but also, I mean, I remember when I left UCD, I couldn't actually read a book for pleasure for nearly a couple of years after it, because I did end up doing like post-structuralism and all that. But I suppose for you, in your literary history writing, it became very kind of culturally, historically based very, very early. I mean, around the kind of passion between women and lesbian culture. That was very early on in your writing.
Yeah, basically, while I was at Cambridge doing a PhD on 18th century fiction, kind of on the side, I published an essay or two about, the long history of writings about love between women. And, a small feminist press asked me to write them a pamphlet. And I was like, can I do a book? So I was doing this all as a kind of a nixer, not doing my PhD, but writing this book that became Passions Between Women instead. And I became a kind of a speed reader, just trawling through 18th century, medical handbooks and newspapers and what other genres, like legal cases, fiction. So I'm afraid I still read way too fast, because those 18th century novels where I'd be skimming through looking for the women's names, it got you into a habit. So I don't think I'm a deep critic or anything, but I think I'm quite good at handling and finding the nuggets in a really huge wodge of material.
That's some skill to have, and I think particularly when we talk about it later on, but I think particularly when you're kind of then adapting your own work to a different genre, to a screenplay, or to I think that kind of being able to find those moments or that gold,
No, good point. Like taking the kind of bird's eye view. Yeah, like for instance, when I sit down to try and make a screenplay of one of my novels, I don't open the book and look at page 1 and say, how do I make that in film? I keep the book shut. I'm like, what do I remember of the story, and how could that happen through light and faces? So yeah, you don't get to, you're obviously, the details matter, but not all the details.
Yeah, or maybe not just going in through the detail, it's kind of.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, big picture first.
Like, it's funny chatting to you. Like, you can kind of nearly see that 7-year-old writing the 13-year-old writing the editor's notes on the side of your page. That voice,
Donoghue's flaws. Yeah. But it's a funny thing, you need both traits, as a writer, or even, in the rehearsal hall, you try out some moments, and then you kind of step back and go, actually, lads, not sure that works, but you have to give yourself permission first, keep the critic at bay.
And come here, before you went to Cambridge, when you left UCD, like, did you have, when you said writing was kind of your thing, right? Writing was kind of what you always wanted to do with it. But like, was there anything else that you kind of, from a career point of view? I remember when I went back to UCD to study English, like a very close aunt and uncle of mine who kind of went, so what type of job is that for? So I was like, I'm not sure yet. But like, was there a career path, or was it writing? Was that kind of?
It didn't occur to me that I could make my living from writing. Okay. I've just been reading David Nicholls' latest novel, Sweet Sorrow, to my daughter. There's a hilarious bit where the only exam that the boy doesn't fail in his GCSEs is art. And he's like joking ruefully about this to his mother, like, oh yeah, I better check out the small ads for artists, artist wanted, start urgently, So it's a bit like that. I thought I would have to have a real job. And I remember a couple of my siblings were in the civil service, and they were like, oh yeah, get into the civil service, that'll work for you. And I was thinking, and my dad was a professor and a lecturer, and I thought I'd fancy that more, because at least I'd get to write about books, for my real job. So I thought I would try and be an academic. So I started a PhD, at the age of 20, intending to be an academic in English and then write my novels on the side. But then a couple of years into it, before my grant money had run out, basically, I sold 2 novels to Penguin, and then I suddenly thought, oh my God, maybe I could get away with doing just this, just the fun stuff. Still can't quite believe it, Mark. Sometimes I think I'm going to get a call saying there's been an error, report for work on Monday.
I think you're safe enough now. I think you're across that bridge. But you mentioned those, that was stir fry. And
yeah, stir fry and hood. Yeah, I couldn't sell stir fry on its own. They all said not good enough. And my agent said, so Emma, write another and I'll sell them both. And I was like, if they don't want one apple, why would they want an apple and an orange? And she was like, no, it shows that as a writer, you'll have legs, they want to invest in you long term. So
wow.
I said, okay. And she was dead right. She sold me as a packet.
That's incredible advice to get at so young of an age as a writer, because normally writers get rejection and you kind of go, oh geez, here we go now, we're going to, as with everyone, but to actually, yeah, that's a really kind of long, a lot. She must have known, again, she must have known you were in it for the long game, whether you got published or not.
Yeah. And also, she said, like, a first novel, we only hear about the debut novels that publishers are massively excited about and pay a lot of money for. You don't hear about all the others, and you never hear about the novels that are sold for the most tiny advances, literally coffee money for the year. And so she said, look, no publisher is going to make money from you from one novel, most likely. So they want, they want to see that you can write about different things. And that's a good example of why it can be worth putting the effort in to get an agent, even though it seems like an indirect route.
Yeah.
Because on my own, I would just have despaired after the 10th publisher turned down Stir Fry. So my agent was really able to sort of guide me over those shoals.
Yeah, it's interesting as well. We speak about that a lot in different kind of professions in the arts, like about people, because you have to view it like you are a bit, part of you is a business. Obviously, there's the artistic bit of you, and some people find that very difficult and therefore do need that support to be able, that someone can be cold and kind of businesslike about it. I come here, just in relation to that, because those two novels were very much about Dublin, about the experience of Dublin.
Yeah, the first one's about UCD, and then Hood is about my secondary school. Yeah. I pretty much used up my experience to date on those.
Yeah, but it was fascinating that kind of that you've by and large kind of moved thematically from that. I mean, obviously you physically moved, but also the sense of the contemporary. Your work spans kind of generational. The themes are kind of timeless, but the actual your work has spanned right back in historical times. Let's say to the very contemporary, both here and in across the water. And I suppose I'm interested, before we get into your particular work, what it's not what comes first, the chicken or the egg, but like, is there a sense? Are you one of those writers that kind of has that? I've heard from many writers that kind of has that amazing feeling of finishing a novel and then going, oh shit, that's start another one. Or is there kind of, are there things that live with you? I mean, you mentioned kind of light and color and and faces in relation to film, but how do novels arrive to you, or is it different every time?
I would say it's more. I certainly don't picture them in light and color. It's more psychological. I get really fascinated by either a plot or a character and how that might play out. It's the kind of what if, I suppose. But I would say, that was such an interesting question. I've got about 4 answers. No, I'm not somebody who goes, oh shit, I have to write another book. It's more that by the time I finish one novel, I have usually started another. And so it's like, oh, great, now I get to move on to this one, which has been eagerly awaiting my attention. So they kind of line up on the right-hand side of my computer screen. I do my projects from like published through to working on through to future ones. So the ones on the right-hand side of my screen are always like, me, come and work on me. So no, there's never a gap. I think with each of I gave birth to both our babies, and I think I took 6 weeks off each time, but that's the longest stretch I'm ever away from it, But in terms of how my work has kind of moved, I would say 3 things happened. Emigrating twice definitely pushed my range geographically. Sometimes it means that I'm confused about whether a phrase in my head is Irish, English, Scottish, American, Canadian, so sometimes my language can be a little bit unmoored because I've moved so much, or my cultural references, but they're certainly much broader than they would have been if I hadn't moved to England and then to Canada. And I would say another thing that happened was that because I left Ireland, I now wasn't always defined as the lesbian writer. So even though I returned to same-sex themes in my work, probably every second or third book, I never felt I sort of had to stick to that. So moving abroad, I would say, let me feel I could write about anything I liked. And also, and then I had one more point. Where's it gone? Never mind. If it's a good one, it'll come back.
It'll work, of course it'll come back. But also, poetry being your first entry to it. And, you've said, that you've a great love of short story form formats. And also then, you've written kind of large books and script. I'm just fascinated by how do you know something, like for example, how do you know the difference early on from something that is a short story or a novel before it's written? That is...
I don't always know beforehand. My first historical novel, Slammerkin, was going to be a short story. I had this concept for a book which became Woman Who Gave Birth to Rabbits, and they would all be short stories inspired by weird little snippets of history, you know, bits where, you know, because the main character was a woman or a sideshow freak or a slave, almost nothing was recorded about them. So so I thought, oh great, each of them will be a short story. And with Slammerkin, I tried it that way, and I realized that to explain why a girl picked up a cleaver and murdered a woman in 1763 would take a novel, you know. So I don't always know in advance, but I usually know if something is meant to be, say, fiction, at least in its first incarnation, or if it's really meant to be something else. For instance, I've got a play called Trespasses that began as a radio play for RTE, because it's all about a woman arrested as a witch in Youghal in the 1600s. And I thought, oh, I want voices in the dark for that one. I want her in her prison cell. I want the whole thing to be voices in the dark, so it has to be radio. So usually whatever the subject is will sort of choose its genre. And then, you know, there's adaptation into other genres, which is another pleasure, because you're bringing out very different aspects of the same story. You know?
And getting a second go at a theme and characters perhaps as well, you know.
Great fun, fun, yeah.
And in relation to the historical novel piece, I mean, I'm fascinated by the PhD about the friendships between men and women. And I think that's such a, just talk a bit about that, because I think that those kind of relationships are there through.
Now I'm rarely asked about my PhD. It ended up being, you know, a fairly dry feminist analysis of how in 18th century fiction, you know, the men and women didn't always have to get married. There was actually this new concept of like the friend, you know, that you could be genuine friends with the opposite sex, which, you know, in women's magazines today, it's still presented as a bit of a kind of, can you be friends with a man? But you know, so that was my topic, but it meant I basically had to read a lot of 18th century fiction, and I got so comfortable with that then my first historical novel was 18th century. And actually, the point I'd forgotten from earlier is that I think doing a PhD expanded my range in history the same way that moving abroad expanded my range in geography. Yeah, I think both those things basically stretched me, you know. And then the other great move in my fiction, in my work, you know, my kids laugh about this, but you know, everything I've written since the kids started coming along 16 years ago has had kids in it somewhere. So the kids are like, well, you really boosted your failing mid-career, didn't you?
Yes, although the kids haven't really, you know, I'm just thinking of two of my favorite books, obviously Room and The Wonder, but they aren't really in the most great positions in life.
No, obviously I don't want to write about happy children. No, I've got a kids series called The Lotteries, and the kids in that are very happy because that's the genre. It's like happy fiction for 8 to 12-year-olds. But yeah, I agree. For my adult books, I make my kids suffer. But to be fair, I make the adults suffer too.
Make everyone
equal
suffer.
Opportunity, bleakness.
You kind of, I think making people suffer beautifully, I think is a great skill of yours. But come here, when like Kiss and the Witch, for example, the play that the core ensemble and are partnering with us on, or us with them, sorry. The relationship between, because I'm fascinated with the relationship between your writing and the Gothic is the wrong word, but the kind of underbelly, let's say, of history, or the unspoken pieces of history and fairy tales and evil, probably the wrong word, but the darkness. When did the idea for kind of Kiss and the Witch, that kind of series, come from?
That is a really rare example of where I didn't come up with the idea. It was dropped in my lap as a gift by Roisin Conroy, who ran Attic Press in Dublin. So this is a genuinely Irish origin to this one. They were doing a series of feminist fairy tales, and they asked me to do a book of feminist fairy tales. Now, I didn't end up publishing it with them. I published it with the British publishers I was with, but I'm always grateful to the late Roisin Conroy for her suggestion. And, you know, I had read people like Angela Carter and so on, who'd done such exciting stuff with fairy tales. And I'd always had an obsessive interest in fairy tales as a child. You know, I used to borrow different volumes of ethnic fairy tales, you know, Russian or Greek or whatever, from the library. And I loved sort of spotting how the same archetypal plot motifs came up over and over. So it had been a lifelong interest, but it was really Roisin's prompt that made me think of doing kind of rewrites, and not in some po-faced politically correct way, but just really, as with adaptation, really making the story new by changing one thing. So in this case, by making them first person stories in the voice of those girls that are in these fairy tales, it just brings out a completely different aspect than when you're sort of overhead camera doing the sort of, you know, agreed communal wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, and it's funny because it reads through. It's fascinating because it does shift the whole kind of dynamic, obviously within the story, but also I think, you know, that idea of, and it's a very kind of political with a small p, but it's there throughout an awful lot of your work about whose gaze, who are we kind of finding the novel through. I mean, you know, I think obviously in Room that's very much there. But even in your other work, there's kind of the voice of the narrator and where that's coming from. And just, has that ever shifted for you as you're developing something, like, you know, in relation to what person this is in, or whether it's a third person, or like,
this is a really good question, Mark. I don't think I've ever been asked it, you know, after, God, I'm 50, and I think of all the interviews I've done, but I've never been asked about this question. But you're dead right. I'm very interested in point of view, maybe because of that experience of growing up thinking like, I see everything a bit differently from the people around me, and what would they think if they saw it from my point of view?
Yeah.
So it's something that I think about so much before I begin a piece of fiction. Obviously, if it's on stage or film, point of views are more multiple anyway. You can still choose, for instance, in the film of Room, we still only have scenes that Jack could see, except briefly when he's in the rug. But fiction is much more point of view, in that every single word will be flavored by who's thinking this, who's saying it. And it's something, I don't think it shifts during the writing, because I take it so seriously as a question that I think about it sometimes for years before I begin, because, you know, a lot of my work, I know I'm going to be writing that story for years. I just haven't time to get to it yet. So by the time I get to it, I've done a lot of sort of brooding over it in spare moments. And one question I really sweat over is exactly who tells this story. And sometimes I can't find my way into the story until I work out who's telling the story. So for instance, one example, I did one short story about a Scottish 18th century cult who, you know, they were an end of days cult who thought the world was ending. So this woman basically rounded up about 50 people and, you know, got them all to lock themselves in a barn with her and wait for Jesus to airlift them away. And I thought this was obviously fascinating material, but I couldn't write a whole novel about it because I didn't want to be stuck in a barn with these people for you know, a couple of months. As they bickered hungrily. And you know, she herself, the cult leader, was such a sort of braggart, you know, so zealous and extreme. I thought, I don't really want her ranting away to my readers. And then I realized that the interesting person to me was the local vicar. Got so caught up that he basically came on board as her booster, her second in command. And I thought, oh, he's interesting. So once I had him, the story wrote itself really quickly. So point of view to me is the key. And I've often wanted to write a sort of omniscient narrator style book. I love Dickens and so on, and modern examples like, say, Zadie Smith. You know, people who just sort of the overhead camera zooming around confidently. And I sometimes think, oh yeah, this book I'll write from an omniscient point of view. And I try, and after about 2 pages, I'm like, this is bullshit. I don't believe this. I have to choose who is my point of view. Somehow now you've given me an actual rationale for this, you know.
There you go. My gift. But I mean, you mentioned, but also as well, I mean, you know, and it's peripheral, but I think, you know, it's important to know that your books were kind of being nominated and winning awards from the word go. Do you know what I mean? So there was that side of your career that kind of, you know, there was notice being put on you in relation to what you were doing. Which is great to have. I know it doesn't necessarily make you a better writer, and sometimes can make you a worse writer, but you know, that was there from the very big beginning. And I suppose when, like again, you mentioned yourself, short stories, novels, poetry, you know, historical fiction, screenplays. Do you find, you know, that challenging, let's say, in relation to how you divide your time now? Do you know what I mean? Is there, you know, in relation, you say that those things are on the right hand side of your computer?
Oh, I'm a bit of a child in a sweetie shop. Yeah. Like I have 2 novels that I really would be happy to work on tomorrow, except that I'm trying to write a musical instead, you know. So I'm always a bit like, oh, I need to get back to that one, but oh, let me just do a bit on this first. But you know, these are good problems to have. It's far better than thinking, what'll I put on this empty screen? And I would say some things are much easier to sell than others, right? So over the years, books of short stories, I've only managed to sell them by kind of tucking them in right after a novel, because if your publisher has an option on your next book, sometimes they will force themselves to buy your book of short stories just to get an option then on the next novel. So yeah, some things are definitely more marketable. Or when I've written sort of scholarly books, it's always been just as a side hobby, as it were. It's never been like how I paid the mortgage or anything. But if I write enough, I can afford for some of the things I write to either reach very few readers or make me very little, because other works of mine will get to lots of people and make me my living. So I think all these decisions would be more agonizing if I was a slower writer, because some writers are like, whoa, I'm going to write a novel. This is the next 6 years of my life.
So you're fast. Do you actually write fast? I
do. I write it fast. It's not always good, God knows, but I write fast. Yeah.
Okay. And then has that child editor remained as a good partner for you? Is that?
Yeah, extremely. Yeah. So yeah, there's the absolute roughest draft for myself, and then there's a tidied up rough draft that would go to my agents only. And then I think I respond very well to feedback. I love the fact that just not looking at it for a month or two will let me see it fresh. And then if I also have the many questions from my agents in the first go and then my editors at the next round, I can often see much more clearly because their questions have sort of provoked me. It's not that they necessarily tell me what to do, but they identify a question and I then get to answer it. So I like writing in those layers of feedback and rewrite. I love rewriting. I like doing, the multiple drafts that, say, in the film world, you have to do multiple drafts of everything. But I would say I like a kind of a close editorial relationship. So writing for one person or just a small group of people. Like typically I would have 3 editors in, Dublin, New York and Toronto. And again, with film, I had such a great time working specifically with Lenny Abrahamson and Ed Guiney as well. So I wasn't writing for some big faceless studio with lots and lots of random people chipping in. I like an intimate collaborative circle.
Yeah. And then, you mentioned short story and then you kind of, you mentioned a brilliant title, The Woman Who Gave Birth to Rabbits. And I think that wins title of whatever the 2000s so far. But I love that kind of, and also around Slammerkin, the idea, I think it's, you've classified it on your website as a kind of, as a why done it, but also that, because that genre now in television in the last 20 years is where all the noir, that's kind of, and an awful lot of new detective novels, we all know kind of who did it, but it's actually more the kind of why. Do you find that, and I'm kind of bridging this into sort of like the likes of Room and The Wonder, like in those why done it historical novels, it's clear what happened, we're exploring the why. But for a lot of the time in, say, Room and The Wonder particularly, we don't know what's going on, and we're trying to figure out what's going on, but it's so claustrophobic because you don't give us the opportunity to think about anything else apart from the head that's seeing it. And that's really fascinating for, and it's different. Obviously, I'm not putting them both together, the two very different approaches.
Oh no, there are similarities. I would say I like to use a lot of suspense, probably more now than I used to. I think if I track my writing since maybe Stir Fry and Hood, I wasn't using, say, suspense in those days. I was clearly doing kind of literary fiction where we're analyzing people's emotions, and I was not using any kind of genre. And in a way, once, I think probably with Slammerkin in the year 2000, because that was about a murder, I thought, okay, I have to write this suspensefully in some ways. So I would say since Slammerkin, a lot of my works have had some element of the thriller in them, but I haven't wanted to stick to the conventions of the thriller so much that it feels kind of cozy and safe. I mean, I love murder mysteries. I love, relatively formulaic but well-made novels. I've read every Lee Child book, for instance. But the genre can sometimes feel a bit constraining, a bit like it's going to be the same pleasure as you had last time. So I suppose I love using elements of, say, the kind of domestic noir in something like The Wonder, but not feeling like I have to hit the beats exactly where people are expecting, And the same with Room. Though obviously some people found Room confusing because it felt like a sort of an escape thriller, and then they're like, oh, hang on, now we have a lot of analysis of the world and of family and so on. So I'm not sure my use of genre would satisfy everybody, but
I think it's a creation of, I think what I personally love about it is the ground. The ground's not static. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of, and that makes it even more thrilling just by placement rather than writing, if that makes sense. Like you kind of, I think there's, and talking about Room, say for example, you know, that moment when things shift completely, when you kind of, when you think you have, you know, what's happening, you think you have, or this is what it's going to be, then something, as you say, we go into a whole different, you know, paradigm in the second half or whatever of the novel. Did that idea, like, did Room, you know, writing within that first person perspective of the child, was that kind of difficult, or?
No, in a way, he was my ideal narrator because I knew everything in his head. I knew every object he had touched as opposed to things he'd just seen on telly. I knew really all the events of his 5 years. So he was kind of ideal. And I knew his world in the first half. I knew everything he was going to see. How high up the bed went. You know, I had it all mapped out on the IKEA design website. You know,
wow.
Obviously, hypothetically buying almost the very cheapest IKEA furniture, I decided that their captor would go for like just one from the bottom, cheap wise. You know.
Yeah.
So no. Once I'd sort of made all the decisions about Room, then actually writing Jack's voice was easy enough. And also our son Finn was 5 at the time. So I followed him around like an anthropologist, you know, writing down his grammar mistakes and the way he'd see things or the questions he'd ask. A couple of entire conversations went straight in there.
Yeah.
You know? I'm an awful parasite on my kids, really, you know.
It's all, you know, copyright free. But did you, I mean, you know, once say that novel kind of left you and, you know, went out into the world, I mean, like, talk about a reaction, you know, it's kind of, was that surprise? I mean, that must have been really kind of mad, you know, that
was completely mad, yeah, because I was used to say, you know, pub day is a day when maybe your editor rings to say congratulations on publishing the book, you know, and then that's all that happens usually. So yeah, Room was mad. And then, you know, with the film 5 years later, it was all even madder. And I realized that all my friends and acquaintances are way more excited by things in the film world than things in the book world. So, you know, people who'd been perfectly calm about my being shortlisted for the Booker Prize, they were like, oh my God, the Oscars, you know. So yeah, that was doubly mad. But luckily all this madness was happening to me in my 40s. If you were 20, you'd have your head completely turned and you'd be expecting, you know, limos with drivers in caps for the rest of your life, you know. But luckily in my 40s, you know, Chris and I just so enjoyed all the kind of, you know, event opportunities and, you know, award ceremonies and so on, always knowing it's not usually like this in the writing world. This is a one-off. I somehow have written a zeitgeisty bestseller, you know, as the publishers would call it. When my publishers were buying Room, one of them said it was a very zeitgeisty novel. And I thought this was such a funny word that I put it into the last draft of the book. I was like, somebody's going to tell Ma that her story is zeitgeisty.
Brilliant. But also, I mean, I think you're right in relation to time of life and stuff as well, because, you know, that's a fantastic attitude to go into that mad world of the media and of the kind of cultural media and of the glitz. But in saying that, you know, in the 5 years between, say, the film and the novel, like, you also, like, Talk of the Town was in the Dublin Theatre Festival. It's gorgeous. So I think it's kind of, there's a kind of moment in time, there was kind of work there that was really kind of interesting in very diverse and kind of different ways, which I suppose from an artist's point of view, it's not like, oh, here's Emma Donoghue who's written Room. It's kind of like, well, actually she's also doing that and this and this. So I think that must be the very freeing, I suppose, space to be in.
You know, again, I think it helped that I was in my 40s, because if you had a huge hit with your first novel, I think you would feel this is what the world wants from me. And it would be very scary to try and deviate from that. Again, Zadie Smith has talked about how hard it was to write the second novel after White Teeth. You know, she sort of sweat blood over that one. Whereas, you know, I already had a very full creative life when Room happened. And also, I didn't think just because I had a bestseller once I should try and replicate that. Room was such a weird book. It would have been completely obvious if I'd been trying to replicate it. You know, you can't do a series of locked up small children. So
here's the female version. Yeah. But also as well, I mean, Room has kind of, we'll talk about the film in a minute, but it also does the kind of play with music that was on in the Abbey 2 years ago here. Which is a very interesting take. I mean, completely different in a way to, and very challenging in its difference, which is kind of really, really interesting. And then obviously working with Lenny on adapting your own work, you know, and that's, you know, that's an amazing I'm still struck with what you said earlier on about kind of not, closing it and kind of going right and writing something new now, or it's a different art form. That must have been an incredible journey. I mean, Lenny's such an amazing kind of person anyway, but like sort of
Oh, he was such a helpful mentor to me, because in a way, I was so self-conscious about the fact that I was a complete newbie when it came to film, that I had like read all the books on screenwriting, and I had absorbed what seemed to be rules like that your protagonist has to push the plot on. So even though my protagonist is a 5-year-old who's never been out in the world before, I was like, okay, he needs to rescue Mal from the mental hospital. So I wrote in this sequence where Jack kind of hails a taxi and jumps in and manages to go, and Lenny was like, that's not really a rule, Emma. We don't need to follow the rules. Don't worry about it. So he was really good at kind of talking me back from overzealous application of the rules. And such a joy to work with, and so smart. Every interview I've ever given with Lenny, I learn a new word from listening to him during the interview. He made me feel like I was not an intellectual. But I am, by comparison with a lot of people, just not by comparison with Lenny.
He did. We did one of these actually just when Normal People was kind of coming out, and we kind of tried to avoid talking about Normal People for at least like an hour. But he was talking about Room, and one of the most fascinating things was and I think this is the strength of your writing, was that it was impossible to replicate the feeling of the book without making the room. You know what I mean? That it kind of that they had to pull everything in. They had to pull cameras in.
That's right. He thought he could cheat it by making it bigger, and then he was like, "No, it actually does need to be tiny."
But I mean, I think that's his strength. I think he's a he comes from that literary. He understands narrative in a way, because I think you particularly, I think, write that sense of feeling within words. So there's a foreboding, say, in Room that is kind of scarier than what's going on in a way, and similarly, and jumping to kind of Wonder as well. I mean, that I just love the Wonder. I just think it's a marvelous piece of writing. But again, that forebodings, because you're like, it's like it reminds me, not in theme, but at the end of David Fincher's film Seven, where the box is in the desert.
Oh, yes.
And your imagination puts way worse things in that box than actually will ever be in that box. But the film has made your head go there. I think that The Wonder is kind of very, very, very similar.
Well, I'm making a film of The Wonder with Element, not with Lenny, with a different director. And I have to say, it's amazing to be working with them again, because they're very savvy about the market, but they're basically focused on protecting the art, So again, I'm having a great experience. And I think because it's Ed Guiney, and because, he'll be making it in Ireland, I think I can really trust him to do a film about 19th century Irish Catholicism without any of the old cliches,
Yeah, no, but it's funny, because you wrote a book which felt on opening like a lot of other books set in, old Ireland, of that kind of clawing, dark Catholicism, whatever, those, moving statues or fasting with girls, that. But very soon you kind of go, oh, okay, we're in a whole different world here. And the actual piece of literature that it reminded me hugely of was The Crucible. I think that kind of sense, that sense of that foreboding, of that nothingness. Do you know what I mean? Of that kind of like of like metafictions, and that in that way, it was a fantastic piece of writing, and actually interesting. I think it would make a great film. But did you find in your writing of that we mentioned earlier on our chat now about all that kind of early work of poetry and crucifixions and but that sense of being able to really excavate Ireland not being here, do you know what I mean, to really go into those feelings, was that kind of a big boon to you in the writing of The Wonder?
I don't know. I think Irish writers are very good at excavating Ireland too. I think being a writer, you make yourself enough of an outsider that you can critique a society even if you're going down the pub every night. You just see things askew. You tell the truth but tell it slant. I think we're always slightly immigrants in our heads, no matter where our bodies go. But certainly it's funny. I only spent the first 20 years in Ireland, but it's so absolutely shaped and favored me. No wonder I keep coming back to it and keep setting books there. It has a kind of a psychic hold on me that I'll never shift, and it's been so interesting to me to see how much it's changed in the last 30 years. I keep up with a lot of Irish people on Twitter and the news and so on, and current cultural battles. So it feels like a live thing. It feels like myself and a lot of other Irish people are interrogating our past and interrogating our culture. It certainly doesn't feel like I'm just, an emigrant throwing stones. I think, I think the critique of Irish society has been really led by people living in Ireland and battling it out.
But did it help you? I suppose what I meant was like more about the kind of sense of from you, like going back to that kind of childhood space, that kind of the. So I was, I'm really taken by the relationship in that book between the visitor and the child, and then the unpacking of kind of everything. But it was like kind of like that. I don't know. It's like when you look back in Ireland, there was a kind of in a similar way now when things are being unpacked here. There's a sense of the huge resistance. There's a huge resistance from a lot of people, and instinctively probably everyone, in case kind of something is unveiled that we go, oh God, it'll all fall apart. But I think, and that's very, very there in The Wonder, that sense of kind of going, you want to find out, but you're also kind of going, oh, I don't want to, it's all grand. And I think that, but is that, how do you manage in your novels that kind of that meta tension? So you're writing kind of, the novel and the narrative. Do you have to go back a lot, Emma, and kind of overarch?
I tinker with the balance. So for instance, in The Wonder, I would say I wrote my problem into it, in that here I am as this outsider who's been gone a long time. And because I'm in the 21st century, of course I'm going to be judgy and misunderstanding things that are happening in the 1850s. So I was an outsider in time and space. So in a way, by writing in the narrator as an English nurse, and who is strikingly judgy about Ireland, dislikes it before she even gets there. So in a way, I'm setting her up as the me character, going like, ew, what is this? Muddy fields. And then of course I subvert her by showing that she gets them wrong in many cases. Yes. So she literally she finds a man down a hole and she assumes he's fallen in and he needs her help, and actually he's digging turf. She misreads Ireland so much. So I got to kind of interrogate my own assumptions and my own judgments of Ireland. So yeah, very often if there's some kind of problem between you and the material, it can help to actually write that in, And basically you should never write an argument scene unless you have some sympathy for both sides and some understanding of both sides. So, okay, for instance, in my newest novel, The Pull of the Stars, it's narrated by a nurse midwife. And at one point she has an argument with a hospital orderly called Groin. He's just back from the front, basically. And he's basically saying, you women shouldn't be getting the vote because you don't actually risk your lives to defend the nation like we do. We men, we pay the blood tax. And she's arguing with him and saying, look around you, we're in a maternity ward. Women are paying the blood tax every day. But I would say that argument would be dead on the page if I was just using him as a kind of a stick figure sexist. I read a lot about World War I. One of Groin's colleagues has half a metal face. Groin has losses of his own. So I've got a huge amount of sympathy for his side and for all that these men were going through in World War I. And they were thinking, these feckin' women taking our jobs while we're gone, So you have to have sympathy for both sides, or it won't be a rich piece of fiction on the page. It'll just be, a setup.
And Kabir, you mentioned like zeitgeisty, but I mean, isn't that set? It wasn't the 100th year of the Great Flu, That's
yes, I know. This was pure accident. I wrote The Pull of the Stars about the 1918 pandemic, and I wrote it, prompted by an article about the centenary of the pandemic. So I wrote it in 2018, 2019, sold it to the publishers as a piece of historical fiction. None of us had any thought of contemporary relevance. And then I finished it on the 3rd of March this year and handed it in, and they said, you know what, it's a bit similar to COVID, no? And I honestly, it hadn't occurred to me. And they'd scheduled the novel to be published next year. And they said, let's bring it out this summer. So I was extremely startled. And yeah, I was not expecting to be doing interviews about COVID all year,
Yeah.
And I didn't change anything about it. I mean, any novel you write about a pandemic is going to reveal the same kind of truths about, lying politicians and, the rich cocooning themselves and the poor getting shafted, poverty as a pre-existing condition. All these things are going to come up, whether you're talking about, the Black Death or COVID-19.
Yeah. And Kabir, then between just be on the cusp of kind of, Oscars and all that, you kind of the frog music, about a frog diver in 1878 or something in San Francisco. So like, how did that come about?
She was a cross-dressing frog catcher who got murdered, shot through a window. Yeah, I came across her Jenny Bonnet in a little kind of a book that looked trashy and that it was a little illustrated popular history thing I picked up in a gift shop once about kind of wild women of the Victorian West, you know. And there's Jenny Bonney, who cross-dressed and caught frogs for the restaurants, and somebody shot her in her mid-20s. And I just thought, who, what, why? And about 10 years later, yeah, I wrote it as a novel called Frog Music. And that novel, I had to actually watch videos on YouTube of, you know, Texans hunting frogs with pointy sticks and so on.
Oh my God, lovely. I'd say there was some suggested, interesting suggested next videos on your YouTube.
I try not to look at the algorithm, and also, you know, the various social medias are always trying to sell me things based on what I've researched. They clearly think I want all these things for real, and I'm like, no, research only.
I come here. I mean, you know, even though it is ancillary, but I mean, to be nominated then for an Oscar, you know, that must have been just the most wildest thing ever. I mean, nominated for a lot of things, but I mean, I suppose in the world of trophies, the Oscar is the one that, you know, friends and family, you know, go, my God.
That's the one they'll remember. Yeah. No, it was a fantastic experience because, you know, film is a uniquely intimidating medium to writers, film and TV, because it's somehow all sort of cocooned in secrecy. You know, you have a feeling of like, oh, that's specialist writing, you know, and really it's no harder than any other kind, but because there's a lot of jargon, a lot of mystery about it, it's more secretive somehow, and it's obviously, films are so expensive to make, that gives the whole thing a kind of a hushed air. So I was quite anxious writing film for the first time, the way I haven't been about writing anything else. And so to get an Oscar nomination with my first one was a huge sort of confidence boost. Yeah, and I've now, since then, I've taken on about 6 different film projects. None of them have made it to the screen yet, which is typical of the world of film. But I really enjoy it as a form of writing. Yeah, I couldn't do it all the time because it would madden me that there's so many delays. You know, even before you get to COVID, you know, there are just so many reasons not to film something this year. In any given year, it's so expensive and complicated and so hard to synchronize everyone's schedules. So that would madden me a bit if it was my full-time writing, but as a part-time thing, it's great. I don't seem to be writing short stories anymore since I've been doing film. I suppose there's a limit to how many genres I can tackle in a single year.
Maybe that wave from the right-hand side of your computer will just wash over you in a couple of years, Emma, and it'll all come flying out. But I mean, sorry, I won't keep it much longer, but I'm just interested in the sense of the visualization of your work. Because I mean, you know, say for example that, you know, novel writing or storytelling or poetry is for your imagination, where film kind of gives you markers. It is also for your imagination, but they're a visual, like you can see the characters, you can see what they look like. Is that a bizarre thing for you to travel in, to kind of, you know, from having room in your head and then there's actors?
Oh no, it is a completely different world. Yeah, I mean, in the book, I've no idea what Jack and Ma look like, and I couldn't care less. And you know, I thought there's no point where a 5-year-old boy is going to start describing his mother's features. You know, so yeah, film is very, very visual. But it's funny. I think Lenny is so literary that he knew that the best way to really capture the feel of a book is not to reproduce every little incident or every little line. It's more that you're going for the same effects on the audience, but you have to use a different technology. So, you know, there are entire scenes where I'd written them with dialogue and they ended up with no dialogue, and I swear nothing was lost. So it's a funny thing. If you're really soaked in the sensibility of the book, you don't actually have to follow it as literally. And we've all seen film adaptations where they pretty much go scene by scene, and yet somehow the magic is not translated.
Yeah. You know? Now also as well, I mean, also I'd say that's a huge amount for you with material. That's all, like in any good kind of art form, it's about that real trusting collaboration as well. You know, that you kind of have, you know, obviously with the people that you work with. Once you kind of get beyond yourself and your editors, when you get to a different format, you want to be trusting the people that you're engaging with as well.
Absolutely. You want to trust that when they suggest a change, it's because they genuinely think it'll be a better film rather than because it'll play better in Ohio.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Then you mentioned earlier on, but just for a minute, just talk to me about the lotteries. You know.
Sure. Yeah, I've got 2 kids' books set in Toronto in a big family of a gay couple and a lesbian couple, and they have 7 kids together. It's funny. I wrote it as 8 kids, and my publishers were all like, "Wow, that's just impossible. Can you make it a big family of 5?" I was like, "I'm sorry, 5 is not a big family. That's ridiculous." I compromised. I killed off one of the twins. It's like combined one twin into the other. He was the introvert anyway. So I ended up with 7. Yeah, and the family are like, you know, mixed race, mixed religion. Some are vegetarians, some are not. You know, they're a very mixed bag, and I had such fun writing about these kids. Yeah. And just trying to capture that vibe of a big family at its best. You know, the way there's always something going on, you know.
And was that a freeing thing for you to do? You know, was that kind of, or was it difficult? Because obviously Room is written from a child's perspective, but very much, you know, an adult, you know, very much in an adult world and how they interplay. But
yeah,
from Audrey's point of view, it's very, very different, I'd imagine.
Yeah, and I didn't want it to sound like Room, so I made the narrator be a girl who's 9, and she's very kind of, you know, grown up for 9, so very different from Room. But the main thing was, because this was a kind of idyllic book, I was trying to write a kind of a, you know, queer multiracial utopia sort of thing. So the vibe is just a complete break from my other books. So I think I was writing The Wonder and one of the Lotteries books, like pretty much back to back, and it was just balm to my spirits, you know. This little starving Irish girl, you know, on one day, and then the next day would be like, let's go to the museum. So yeah, you have to kind of build in breaks for yourself, you know, whether it's, you know, during COVID, I've been watching the brilliant comedy Schitt's Creek as a little kind of morning consolation. If I wake up early and worry about the world, I watch Schitt's Creek. So whether it's little comforts for yourself, or, you know, reviving holidays with friends, say, or working on a very different genre, all these things help give your brain the kind of breaks it needs. You know, I wouldn't be trying to write 2 grim novels at the same time.
It's just making me imagine then that Emma Donoghue wakes up one morning and kind of goes, is this a Lotteries day or is this the Wonder day, depending on how I'm feeling?
And, you know, I have to admit that I could be writing a really grim scene, but really enjoying it. If the scene's going well, then I'm having a good day, even if my characters are suffering.
Yeah,
you know? I mean, I worry a bit about the relationship of the author to her characters. I think we are, basically, when I was writing Room, I suddenly realized, oh my God, the writer is always the psychopath who has locked these people up and is limiting their resources and is putting challenges in their path, you know?
Yeah.
Basically, we are the captors. You know?
Well, actually, speaking about that, I mean, you know, your most recent, beyond your new novel, Akin, your previous novel, is kind of in some ways, you know, about a lot of your kind of journey in novels, about you kind of, you know, with Professor, not about you, sorry, but like the journey about going to the south of France to unpack. So, you know, that's kind of interesting. It's kind of lifting that kind of feeling of kind of being immersed in, obviously, the first person of reading your historical novels, and now it's kind of exploring one of those characters going in search of that. That's fascinating. Was that kind of really interesting to write?
It was, you know, writing from the point of view of a 79-year-old man, it was a great stretch for me, you know.
Yeah.
And I, you know, you might think that I just kind of tried to channel my dad, but actually it was really just me with more age added. It was like, okay, what about me walking down the promenade in Nice, but with a stiff hip, you know, and needing a toilet, you know? And because I'm, you know, my background is fairly professorial, it was not that much of a stretch to make myself sound like an academic of 79, except I made him a chemist to make it different from me. But yes, in a way, you know, it's really fun to use autobiographical material. So myself and my partner, who's an academic and who's French, we've spent 2 separate years and a few shorter times in France, and I got to use all that material in the book, but from the point of view of this 79-year-old who's visiting France to try and sort of work out the mysteries in his family history. So that would be a lovely example of where you can use your material, but you give it a different spin just by changing the point of view.
Yeah. And then, as I said, your new novel came out this summer, and obviously, as you said, it was kind of a weird zeitgeisty moment. And now as we remain still within this kind of, you know, paradigm that we're in, do you get a sense, I mean, has this kind of been a difficult time for you? Has it had any effect on you creatively, Emma, or has it just been?
I would say the early months I was a bit under par just from sheer anxiety about the world, you know. But you know, given that I write a lot anyway, it's okay to slow down for a few months. And I would say no, now I'm writing pretty normally again. Yeah. And I have to say, writing stuff set in the past can be a great relief from the present day. I've got one project set around the start of COVID, but like many writers, I'm sort of uncertain about, you know, is it a distinct phase in our lives, or is it just how things are from now on? I mean, a lot of people don't quite know how to place their fiction in relation to COVID. You know?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating as well, you know, having, as you say, all the social kind of stuff that is becoming apparent, political stuff is becoming apparent all over the world. You could map back to that period in time of 1980, you know, the Great Flu, and kind of this is the First World War. And it's kind of, I think that's a really interesting thing you said, is like no one knows, artists don't know about what work, not what work they should be creating, but like, you know, is this a moment in time, or is this kind of something that's going to have entrails spreading out, you know, for the guts of a decade? And I think maybe actually Schitt's Creek is a much better space than pondering that question.
I would recommend it for everything that ails you. Yeah, deeply, deeply comforting.
Emma, look, come here. Thanks so much for taking part in this. It's been an absolute.
Oh, thank you. My God, so well read in my work. I'm stunned.
Well, people do.
Even the PhD got a name.
People do read your work. No, but listen, it's been a great pleasure, and long may you write. And hope to see you back in Ireland when we all can kind of move again, someday soon. And it's great actually to be working in partnership with the Core Ensemble on, you know, I've seen some of the rushes and the trailer of the film, so I think it's gonna look great.
You know, this is a perfect example of how you have to sort of seize opportunities during COVID. Like, I was hoping Kissing the Witch would get, you know, a good solid Irish production, but instead it's going to be available for anyone through this digital version. So, you know, we all have to try and make the best of this weird time, eh?
Yeah. All right, Emma, thanks so much.
My pleasure, Mark. Thanks so much for the questions.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.